Final Fantasy VI turned 30 this year, and while I know that within those 30 years there have been thousands of videos made about this game, I wanted to add mine to the mix because this is my favorite video game of all time, and I wanted to celebrate its 30th anniversary because I might not be around to celebrate the 40th. Now, I don't mean to be too melodramatic here. As far as I know, I'm in good health, but I'm middle-aged now, and some of the friends I used to play video games with as a kid have died, and some of the places where I used to discuss video games don't exist anymore. One such place was Gamewiz, an AOL message board that was one of the most popular places to discuss video games back in the mid-90s. Unfortunately, AOL shut that forum down, and its founder, Dr. Gamewiz, passed away in 1999. I only found out about this in a GameFAQs walkthrough for Final Fantasy Anthology that was dedicated to him. Another early internet site I remember was Cafe Eblana, which was specifically dedicated to Final Fantasy games. I think I discovered this website when it was mentioned in an issue of GamePro or Nintendo Power or something like that. Anyway, it also no longer seems to exist except for some reminiscing on random message boards. Thankfully, one of the Final Fantasy websites that I visited back in the early 2000s is still alive and well, and that's Caves of Narsh. Shout out to Rangers51. Josh, if you somehow stumble upon this video, kudos to you for keeping this place up and running for so long. Anyway, the reason I'm reminiscing about all of this is because I played this game when I was a teenager, and those of you who are around the same age as me now don't need me to explain gaming nostalgia to you. But for those of you who are younger, I'm telling you this story in the hope that you'll appreciate your gaming communities and friends now, because when you get older, they quite literally might not exist anymore. So, look, I know this game has been discussed to death. There's even a retrospective video out there that's 5 hours long, and holy crap, that's dedication. But on today, the 30th anniversary of its North American release, I thought I'd make a video explaining why this game means so much to me, and why it remains my favorite game 30 years later. Cinematic. That's the one word I would use to describe how Final Fantasy VI distinguished itself from other games of the time. Back in the mid-90s, the most you usually got was a title screen where you hit start and jumped straight into the game. But Final Fantasy VI begins with these ominous organ chords set against a dark backdrop. Then it transitions into the world's backstory, introducing us to a world where magic no longer exists. It's a thing of legend, something rumored to have once laid waste to the world. Our story takes place 1,000 years later in a steampunk setting reminiscent of the Industrial Revolution, but where an evil empire intends to use those emerging technologies to revive the destructive force of magic, their quest for power putting the entire world in peril. We're then introduced to Terra, a mysterious magic user who's being controlled by the Empire. They're marching towards the mining town of Narsh to capture a recently unearthed magical creature known as an Esper. And as they walk towards the town, the opening credits roll while accompanied by a variation of Terra's theme, the main theme of the game. I'm not going to delve deeply into the story of Final Fantasy VI, suffice it to say that it's an intricately woven tale that goes far beyond its initial Star Wars-inspired setup of rebels trying to take down an evil empire. This is also a game that dealt with serious issues like suicide and teenage pregnancy in a time when such things were unheard of in video games. In fact, it was deemed a little too sensitive for North American audiences, and so several scenes were censored. This included relatively innocuous things like renaming the pubs to cafes, to far more pivotal moments of storyline development, like the aforementioned suicide attempt being translated as an leap of faith. This might be a good time to make a quick mention of the original North American localization, where this game was originally called Final Fantasy III because it was only the third game in the series released outside of Japan. The translation was done by Ted Woolsey, who's kind of infamous for his Woolseyisms, which are odd turns of phrase like son of a submariner. In Woolsey's defense, he was pressured to complete the translation in like a month, while also having to comply with Nintendo of America's censorship policies, so it's not really his fault. And the original translation does have a kind of endearing charm to it, although maybe that's just the nostalgia talking. In any event, if you're looking for a translation that's more accurate to the original Japanese, then you should probably play one of the later re-releases, although some of those lose the charm of the original in other ways, with things like redesigned sprites. What really drives this game more than anything though is the character development. The cast of characters includes 14 playable characters, 2 of which are entirely optional, the biggest cast ever assembled for a Final Fantasy game. Unlike most other Final Fantasy games, and most games in general, there is no clear-cut main character in Final Fantasy VI. Terra probably comes closest, but there are substantial portions of the game where she's either absent or relegated to the background. That's true of pretty much all the characters, and it gives you a great sense of choice when selecting your party, and some of those choices can have a substantial impact on the game and the story. For example, there's the Silent Ninja Shadow, who you can pay to join your party at various points of the game, but who can also be lost for the entire second half of the game if you make the wrong decision. Even though the characters are portrayed in 16-bit sprites, they feel more like real people than some of the realistic 3D models that we see in games today. That's because their characterizations are distinct from one another, as are the issues that they face and need to overcome. Whether that be Terra's search for a sense of identity, or Edgar and Sabin's strained relationship, or Locke's unending quest to atone for the mistakes of his past. Each of the characters has a unique background that makes them relatable and drives the story. This is true even of the less prominent characters, like the aforementioned Shadow. Having him in your party at certain points in the game will trigger flashback scenes that flesh out his backstory and reveal surprising connections to some of the other characters. There's also a great cast of villains, and yes, I say villains, plural. Most people have probably heard of Kefka, even if they've never played a Final Fantasy game. He's considered one of the greatest video game villains of all time, and it's not hard to see why with his quirky personality and nihilistic outlook. Lots of people have compared him to the Joker, and it's an apt comparison, except that Kefka can use magic, which makes him much more powerful than the Joker. The villain that doesn't get as much recognition is Emperor Gestahl. The primary complaint about Gestahl is that he's just your stereotypical evil emperor, like Palpatine from Star Wars, but I think that doesn't do Gestahl justice. This man is a master manipulator and power-hungry maniac. Basically, everything that goes wrong in this game can be blamed on the empire that Gestahl built, including Kefka, who was one of the Empire's first Magitech experiments and was driven insane by the process. There's so many other great supporting villains too, like General Leo, he could be my friend if he weren't my enemy, a man who's caught between his loyalty to the Empire and his sense of honor, feelings that are increasingly brought into conflict with Kefka's horrific acts. And I can't forget about Ultros, the self-proclaimed octopus royalty who largely serves as comic relief, appearing multiple times throughout the game to pester the party at the most inconvenient times. It's such a large cast of characters that it feels like it could be a large theatrical production, or dare we say, even an opera. Of course, I can't talk about this game without discussing Nobuo Uematsu, the composer of the game's soundtrack. This man literally created a 16-bit opera, and that might not even be the most intricate piece of music in the game. That might belong to Dancing Mad, the theme for the final boss fight, which is separated into 4 different movements that range from Baroque to prog rock. It's absolutely astounding. I can't think of any other composer of the Super Nintendo era who came close to pushing the boundaries of video game music. In my opinion, Uematsu really shines most in his use of leitmotifs. There are separate themes for each of the characters, and he weaves those themes into different parts of the game, where the music creates a subconscious memory recall with the emotions you experience during other parts of the game. For example, take Terra's theme. which is the initial theme of the overworld map and evokes a sense of adventure. But gets slowed down in the track known as Awakening, which is usually played throughout the game whenever Terra is struggling with her sense of identity. It happens so often that it's impossible not to associate it with Terra's sense of sadness, so much so that people usually assume that Awakening is Terra's theme. Or how about Kefka's theme, which starts off with this kind of clownish circus music corresponding with Kefka's sense of comic relief, but then takes on a much more sinister air with a cacophony of sound, emblematic of the destruction caused by Kefka's madness and nihilism. This theme is later reused in the Magitech research facility, where it's mixed with this rhythmic sound of machinery to create this kind of techno beat. It really fits the factory setting while also reminding you that the unpredictable villain is lurking right around the corner. All of these different elements, the story, the characters, the music, and the overall cinematic presentation of the game created an interactive and immersive experience that far exceeded anything else on the Super Nintendo up until that point. Today we have the kind of opposite problem where some games focus so much on flashy graphics and cutscenes that they forgo the most crucial element of any video game, the gameplay. Final Fantasy VI does not make that mistake. Like in previous Final Fantasy games, it has a bunch of different character classes like the Thief, the Ninja, and the Engineer, and each of these characters possess a unique skill that corresponds to their character class. For example, Edgar the Engineer can make use of various tools, and his twin brother Sabin, who's a monk, can do various martial arts techniques via button inputs similar to a fighting game. However, there's a substantial amount of character customization both through the use of relics, items that can be found throughout the game and grant special attributes, or by equipping Magicite, which grants the players a unique summon and also permanently teaches them certain corresponding magic abilities. While certain weapons, armor, and relics are restricted by class, Magicite can be equipped by just about any player, so magic is where the game is at its most customizable. As with other Final Fantasy games of the time, the combat mostly consists of random encounters, and this is probably the most annoying part of the game, especially when you just want to get on with the story, but instead you're called into battle every 3 steps. There's a relic later on called the Moogle Charm that you can equip to avoid random encounters, but early on you'll just have to grin and bear it. Like in other Final Fantasy games of the SNES and PS1 era, Final Fantasy VI uses the active time battle system. After every turn, your character has to wait for a gauge to fill back up before they can enter a command. Enemies also have these gauges, although you can't see them, so if you get indecisive about choosing a command, the enemy might attack. This lends a sense of immediacy to the battle that was missing in strictly turn-based RPGs of the era. The other part of the gameplay that I really enjoy is the sense of exploration. There's so much you can miss on your first playthrough, like secret items or Magicite that unlock some of the most powerful weapons and spells in the game, as well as hidden cutscenes. Just by way of example, there's this random scene you can stumble upon where Setzer is repairing the airship that I never even knew about until like 15 years after my original playthrough. This sense of exploration becomes much more pronounced in the second half of the game, which is essentially an open world. Perhaps one of the earliest examples of such in a video game. Without getting into too much of a spoiler territory, the theme song of the second half of the game is called Searching for Friends, because you're basically trying to put the band back together. The party split up, and now you've got to find everyone and convince them to rejoin the group and continue saving the world. There are only 3 characters that you're forced to have at this point, and actually you can go straight to fighting the final boss if you want. Otherwise, you're free to explore the map however you see fit, and there is so much to explore in the second half of the game. Being able to tackle it in just about any order you want is truly remarkable for something from the Super Nintendo era. But what's even more remarkable is how much this game has held up. There are so many different versions of this game now that I can't vouch for all of them simply because I haven't played all of them. But as long as it maintains the core elements of what made Final Fantasy VI great, then you should definitely give some version of this game a try, because this remains one of the most revolutionary video games of all time, and shouldn't be overlooked by any serious RPG fan. And for those of you who have already played Final Fantasy VI, well, you don't need me to convince you, and nostalgic reminiscing will bring you back to this game again someday. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. RPGs are my favorite genre, and I would like to make more videos covering them. Engaging the reception to this video will help me to decide whether or not to continue down this route. Thanks for watching this video, and take care.